I want to give a quick shout out to my patrons. Thank you so much for your support. Hey y'all, it's Kay from Letter Apothecary and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to start our best of 2022 reads. So the way I did this is similar to the way I did it last year. If you were around last year, I took most of the books that I've read in 2022 and put them in a random bracket generator. And then I went and wrote down our matches here. So I gave myself a couple parameters this year compared to last year. I did not include DNFs, and I didn't include rereads or anything that I rated below 3 stars. So there's about 90 some books total. I am only going to be doing round 1 today, so you have to come back again next week to find out which books moved on to round 2. There are some books that, because there are so many, got automatic buys into round 2. It's kind of a March Madness type of bracket. If you've seen any kind of brackets for any kind of sporting events, you know the way that this goes. We have 2 books go up against each other, and I decide which one moves on, which one goes home. Single elimination, because we'd be here forever if it wasn't. I did also add in one more rule this year compared to last year, and that is a book that gets had a 5-star rating that goes up against a lesser rated book automatically gets to move on to the next round. So this is going to be really fun. You guys loved this last year. It was a lot of fun to do last year. I believe it was The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern won last year's tournament of reads. So let's get started. This is round 1 of the 2022 best books that I've read. Our first matchup, we have Night Shift by Stephen King. This was a book of short stories by Stephen King. I read this along with, as I read along with Jake at the Bookish Drummer. And that is paired up against Escaping First Contact by T.S. Beyer. This was a science fiction book. So all of these are completely randomized orders. The computer did all of these matchups. I don't know until I read them off who's matched up against who, just to make it fun for you all. So Night Shift I gave 3.5 out of 5 stars, and Escaping First Contact I gave 4 out of 5 stars. In Night Shift there were some stories that I loved, some stories that I liked, and some stories were okay, some I could do without. Escaping First Contact I thought was a really fun science fiction book. It had great pacing, great characters, and in this round I'm going to give this one to Escaping First Contact by T.S. Beyer. So that'll move on to round 2, and Night Shift by Stephen King is going home. Not all the rounds will necessarily have the books that are ranked higher moving on, but in that case we have that. Our next battle up, we have Jade War by Fonda Lee versus The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. Now this is a hard one because this one I gave 5 stars to both books that I read. So The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, this book had fantastic characters. The audiobook of this book, the narrator made me feel emotions in this book. The characters made me feel emotions. But when you go down to the bottom of it, it was the narrator of the audiobook really that made this book 5 stars for me, and not so much the book itself. Whereas you have Jade War by Fonda Lee. This is book 2 in the Green Bones saga, and Fonda Lee's writing is just so good. If you don't know, the Green Bones saga is this Asian-inspired fantasy, dark fantasy with the mafia themes, and it's just so well done. Her writing is so good. Her characters are absolutely fantastic. Some of the best characters I read all of last year. Great fantasy, great way of pulling in the magic of the fantasy with the urban world that she created in this. And when I was reading Jade War, I did not want to stop reading that book. So this round goes to Jade War by Fonda Lee, although I really did enjoy the Song of Achilles. Our next matchup, we have Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree up against Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. Now this is a tough one because Legends and Lattes was a very cozy fantasy read. A lot of people absolutely loved it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I didn't like it quite as much as a lot of people did, and they were surprised by this. I thought it was a great book. It was written really well, but it just was missing something to make it a 5-star read for me. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell was something unlike anything I had ever read before. This is a fantasy, historical fantasy, which was one of the first that I had read in that genre. It had amazing characters. The wit in the characters were just absolutely fantastic. Great magic, spectacular magic. I loved the historical tie-in. It felt well rehearsed and had a gradual build up to the culmination of what happened in the end. And this was one of the things that led me to love historical fantasy as a genre and one of my favorite genres or subgenres. And so I have to give this round to Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell just because of what it did for my love for historical fantasy. Next up, we have The Girl in the Tower by Catherine Arden versus Lord John and the Hand of Devils by Diana Gabaldon. Now, y'all know how much I love Diana Gabaldon. She's the author of the Outlander series, and then she started this spin-off series about Lord John Grey. He's my favorite character in the whole series. I love him. But this Lord John Grey book, this was a book of short stories. I think maybe 1 novella in it. The writing was great, but the stories felt a little flat for me. It was good, but not as good as I expected. I gave this one 3.5 out of 5 stars. The Girl in the Tower is book 2 in the Bear and the Nightingale series, the Winter Night Trilogy, I think it's called. And this was just as magical as book 1. I absolutely loved this series so much. This is, again, kind of historical fantasy, but more fantasy than history. We've got some military, some fantasy, strategy. We got more plot development in book 2 than we did in plot 1, and I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars, so this is an automatic move on for The Girl in the Tower by Catherine Arden. Our next matchup, we have Wizard's First Rule by Terry Goodkind up against the Folklore of Discworld, Legends, Myths, and Customs from the Discworld with helpful hints from Planet Earth. This is another 5-star matchup. Both of these books I gave 5 stars. In Wizard's First Rule, this is one of the first books I read of 2022. I loved the lore and the story of this book, and the audio book felt very dramatic, which was well appropriate for this book. The Folklore of Discworld was so fantastic because it took all of the myths and the legends from Terry Pratchett's Discworld and tried to make sense of it in our modern day Earth terms. It had all of the quirk of Discworld with science, mythology, and even Sir Terry himself. This one, even though they both had 5 stars, this one I have to give it to the Folklore of Discworld because it just made me love Discworld even more. Next up, we have Starsight by Brandon Sanderson versus The 12 Blades in Contempt by Jordan Darrett. This is a matchup of 2 4-star books. So Starsight is book 2 in the Skyward series. I absolutely loved the first book. The second book, I enjoyed this, but I felt like it needed more embot, and I did not like the ending at all. 12 Blades in Contempt was a self-pub book that I read towards the end of 2022, and I thought this was a great debut book with a fantastic, excellent plot. I give this one to 12 Blades in Contempt by Jordan Darrett because that plot had me turning the page each and every time. Next up, we have Ink and Bone by Rachel Kane versus How to Marry Keanu Reeves in 90 Days by K.M. Jackson. This is another 4-star matchup. So with Ink and Bone, I loved the story and the characters and the ideas, and I just wanted more of it. Luckily, it's a series, so we're going to get more as I continue with this series. How to Marry Keanu Reeves in 90 Days was a very cute romance. I listened to this audiobook while I was moving apartments and packing and unpacking books, and it did the job for what I needed. But I have to give this to Ink and Bone by Rachel Caine because I just wanted more of that world. Our next matchup is going to be a tough one for some people. Red Rising by Pierce Brown versus Falkner by Mary Shelley. This is another 4-star round for us. So Red Rising, for me, this was a slow start. It read a bit young, a bit YA, but it had great storytelling, and I can't wait to read more of this series. It felt a little bit like it was mixed genres, fantasy, science fiction, sci-fi, fantasy, if I remember right. Falkner by Mary Shelley. This was a very compelling story with amazing characters as Mary Shelley creates. So this is a tough one. I'm going to give this one to Red Rising because it made me want to read more of the series, whereas I already wanted to read more Mary Shelley, which is why I read Falkner. So this one I'm going to give to Red Rising by Pierce Brown. And that'll make a lot of people really happy. Next up we have The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky versus Waking Ursa Minor by Helen Reig Peterson. This is an easy one for me, although I enjoyed some of The Idiot. I found the characters really relatable. Waking Ursa Minor was a 5-star read for me, whereas The Idiot was only 3 stars. And so I will save my thoughts on Waking Ursa Minor when we get to that in the next round. Next up, we have The Insider by Ridley Pearson versus The Last Time I Lied by Riley Sager. This is another 4-star round for me. I rated both of these books 4 stars. So The Insider was actually the last book in the Kingdom Keepers series, which was the first book in my Books My Boyfriend Gave Me series. I read the last book first, which was an unusual experience. So naturally, I was confused at times during this read. There were unexplained parts that were then explained earlier in the series. But this book was so unique in its premise and its characters that I really loved it, and I enjoyed most of that series. The Last Time I Lied, there were so many twists and turns that you never knew what was going to happen or who to trust. Even the narrator you couldn't trust. By the end, I actually forgot who I originally suspected. So I really enjoyed that. But I'm going to give this one to The Insider by Ridley Pearson because that book was just so unique, and that storyline and that idea was just so unique. I have to make it go to the next round. Next up, we have another book from my Book My Boyfriend Gave Me series. This is Jacinto's Remnant by Karen Travis. Up against The Winter of the Witch by Catherine Arden. This one sadly is an easy choice because I gave The Winter of the Witch 5 out of 5 stars. So that's an automatic advance for that book. Jacinto's Remnant had more character development than we had in previous books. I believe this was book 2 or 3 in the Gears of War series, and had a good story here, but I only gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. So sadly, that's the end of the road for Jacinto's Remnant. Our next matchup, we have The Passengers by John Mars, up against The Seventh Cadence by Jim Wilborn. Now, I gave The Passengers 4 out of 5 stars. I thought this was a thrilling read with lots of twists and turns. And The Seventh Cadence had amazing world building with great characters, and Jim Wilborn has become a good friend of mine. Later on in this video series, you'll hear about his next book in this series. This one I'm going to give to The Seventh Cadence because I could not stop thinking about that book, and I recommend it all the time. Our next round up, we have Disney at Dawn by Ridley Pearson, which is again one of those books in the Kingdom Keepers series. This is book 2. Up against Bruno, Chief of Police by Martin Walker. This is another automatic move on for Bruno because I gave that 5 out of 5 stars, whereas I only rated Disney at Dawn 3 out of 5 stars. So I enjoyed Disney at Dawn. It was fine, but there were a lot of contradictions even in the first book or in the last book that made it a really confusing read for me. Even characters' names and their characteristics were changed, and that was just confusing trying to figure out who they actually were talking about. Our next matchup is another 5-star matchup. We have The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde up against The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. Now, The Importance of Being Earnest was absolutely hilarious. I loved it. It found me at the right time. It displayed Oscar Wilde's wit so well. But The Space Between Worlds is a science fiction, interdimension traveling book that I couldn't stop thinking about after I read it. It's absolutely stunning. A standalone book, I believe a debut book, and I still think about it to this day. Top-notch world building, world upon world building, and it was just so well done that I recommend it whenever anyone is looking for a good science fiction read. So Space Between Worlds advances in that round. Our next matchup, Book of Cold Cases by Simone St. James versus A Natural History of Dragons by Marie Brennan. This is an automatic move on for A Natural History of Dragons because I gave that one 5 out of 5 stars, and Book of Cold Cases only got 4 out of 5 stars. But in A Book of Cold Cases, the creep factor in this book was so strong. One of our main characters in this book, I kept thinking of one of the bad guys from Criminal Minds because it was just so well done. Sometimes it was a little predictable, but other times I had no idea what was going to happen. Next up, we have The Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter by Theodore Goss up against The Maid by Nita Prose. Sadly, this is going to be a automatic move on for A Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter because I gave that one 5 out of 5 stars. The Maid, I really, really loved that book, but I only gave it 4 out of 5 stars, so it's the end of the road for The Maid. But it had great characters that were relatable, felt a little bit predictable, as sometimes thrillers can be. Kind of not about the story itself, but about the characters instead, especially our main character, Molly. But it just felt like it was missing something for me to give it that 5-star read. Next matchup, we have Coalition's End by Karen Travis versus The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. This is another automatic move on for me. The Hitchhiker's Guide, I gave 5 out of 5 stars. This was hilarious, unforgettable, and exactly what I needed at the moment. Although Coalition's End by Karen Travis, this was one of maybe even my favorite books so far in the Gears of War series. This was almost 5 stars. I gave this one 4.5 out of 5 stars. I feel like these books get better as you move on. And this, I believe, was number 4 in the Gears of War series. We are nearing the end of our matchups for this round. Next up, we have Blood Curse by Tamara Lowry up against Dark Passage by Ridley Pearson. So these are both 4.5 star ratings. So this is going to be a tough one. Blood Curse is, if you love vampires and pirates, and vampire pirates, mermaids and sirens, and witches, you would love this book. This one was not quite 5 stars for me, but close. I thought this was such a unique take on the vampire and pirates and witches mythologies. It was so much fun. Dark Passage by Ridley Pearson was number 6 in the Kingdom Keepers series. And aside from the last book in the series, I thought this was probably the most exciting in the entire series, and it felt like it was well thought out. But it also felt like it was part 1 in a book instead of, felt like there was, it ended on such a cliffhanger that it felt like Ridley Pearson read out this giant book and then just cut it in half. So I'm going to give this one to Blood Curse by Tamara Lowry because that was just such a unique take on all of those legendary myths. Next up is A Handful of Souls by Stephen Rice versus Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. This is a 4-star versus a 3-star, and although it's not an automatic move on for a 5-star, it's an easy choice for me. Lord Jin was extremely complex and hard to follow at times, and it felt like it was trying to live up to Heart of Darkness, his other book. Whereas Handful of Souls was a self-pub book I read, had awesome characters, a great story, and I can't wait to see where it goes because this is only book 1 in that series. So this round goes to Handful of Souls by Stephen Rice. Next up, we have another Mary Shelley book, The Last Man by Mary Shelley, up against A Bad Business by Fyodor Dostoevsky, another Dostoevsky book, so a clash of the classics if you want. This is an automatic move on for Mary Shelley with 5 out of 5 stars to The Last Man. A Bad Business was a collection of short stories by Dostoevsky, and there was such a range of stories in this collection. I enjoyed most of them, but not all, which is why I gave it 4 and not 5 stars, but I enjoyed that buddy read with a bunch of my friends. Next up, this one is going to be a tough one, I think. Stamped Racism, Anti-Racism, and You by Jason Reynolds and Ibram X. Kennedy versus The Embroidered Book by Kate Hartfield. These are both 5-star reads for me, so a battle of the 5 stars again. I think I'm going to give this one to The Embroidered Book by Kate Hartfield. This is another historical fantasy, and there was just so much in this book, and it was so good. I want to reread it as soon as I finished it, and I can't wait to unpack more out of this book. And Stamped, well, this was an amazing book. It felt like it's a must-read for everyone, but especially young kids. It was a brilliant YA adaptation of Ibram X. Kennedy's book, Stamped from the Beginning. I don't know that it can go up against The Embroidered Book. This is a tough one, but I'm going to go with The Embroidered Book, my first gut reaction. And move on to So I Don't Think About It Anymore and Change My Mind. Next up, this one is going to be an easy choice for me. Jade Legacy by Fonda Lee. Up against Lord John and the Brotherhood of the Blade by Diana Gabaldon. Even though this is both 5-star reads for me, Jade Legacy was one of the best books I've ever read. So I'll talk more about that in the next round. But Lord John and the Brotherhood of the Blade, this one felt like the most like Outlander books, and the most like the Lord John that we knew from the Outlander books. And I loved everything about this book, which is why I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, but it just can't compare to Jade Legacy. Next up, we have Just Last Night by Mahiri McFarlane against The Echo Wife by Sarah Gailey. This is an automatic move on for Just Last Night with 5 out of 5 stars. And The Echo Wife, I loved the questions that this book raised. This was a science fiction thriller about cloning people. And it raised some really important questions, not only about the ethics of cloning, but also just about nature versus nurture and what makes us who we are. But I only gave this 3 out of 5 stars because it felt kind of flat for me. I couldn't relate to the characters, which is a big thing for me when I'm reading. And we have just 2 matchups left. Guns of the Dawn by Adrian Tchaikovsky versus Anvil Gate by Karen Travis. This is an automatic move on for Guns of the Dawn because I rated this 5 out of 5 stars. I gave Anvil Gate 4 out of 5 stars. I enjoyed this one a lot. This was book 3 in the Gears of War series. I felt the writing was good, and they used the flashbacks very effectively in this book, especially compared to the first 2 books, but it unfortunately was 4 stars and so does not move on. And then our last matchup for this round, we have Rasselas, the Prince of Abyssinia by Samuel Johnson versus Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. This is an interesting matchup because I enjoyed parts of both of these books, but not the full book. I'm going to give this one to Her Body and Other Parties, which was a collection of short stories. And we will say that I appreciated the philosophical questions raised in Rasselas, but I lost track of the actual story many times, and it was hard to continue in this story. So that's round 1 in my best of 2022 reads. Tune in next week to see who goes up against who on round 2 and who moves on to round 3. If you haven't seen your favorite books that I read this year in this round, you'll see them in the next round, in round 2. Like I said at the beginning, there are a bunch of books that just got automatic bids onto the next round because there are so many books. So let me know in the comments below, what decisions were you surprised by? Which ones do you agree with? Which ones don't you agree with? Would you make the same decisions that I did on these books and these matchups? As always, my Patreon and my Discord information will be in the description below. Keep reading, and I love you all to the moon and back. Bye.